A Roman historian traveling through the Germanic forests in 98 AD witnessed something that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about civilization. Publius Cornelius Tacitus watched in stunned silence as Celtic druids performed rituals that turned sacred groves into theaters of unimaginable horror. His account, buried in the archives for centuries, describes human sacrifices so elaborate they resembled artistic performances, where victims were transformed into living offerings to gods whose names Romans dared not speak aloud. What you're about to discover comes from documented historical sources that reveal how the Celts used ritualistic violence as a pathway to divine power, a method of social control, and a weapon that could break the minds of even battle-hardened Roman legions. These practices shaped ancient Europe and influenced concepts of mysticism that echo through modern times. The evidence was so disturbing that Roman senators initially dismissed Tacitus's reports as propaganda designed to justify their brutal campaigns against Celtic tribes. From sacred groves where human heads decorated oak trees like grotesque ornaments to ritual drownings performed as grand ceremonies witnessed by entire communities. From systematic torture designed to extract prophecies from dying victims to elaborate festivals where violence and spirituality merged into something that would horrify modern audiences. The Celts created a religious system where death was not the end of existence, but merely a doorway to power that could be manipulated through precise applications of controlled brutality. Celtic society operated under a belief system so complex and terrifying that it took Roman scholars decades to comprehend its true scope. At its heart was the concept of the otherworld, a parallel realm where the dead continued to exist and could influence the living through properly conducted rituals. The Druids, Celtic priests who combined the roles of judge, teacher, doctor, and executioner, served as intermediaries between these worlds. Their power was absolute because they controlled access to divine knowledge and could determine who lived, who died, and who was chosen for the sacred honor of becoming a human offering to the gods. In Celtic society, your spiritual standing determined whether you lived as a respected member of the community or died as a sacrifice to ensure the tribe's survival. The Druids maintained intricate hierarchies based on their understanding of cosmic forces that governed all existence. These weren't random acts of violence disguised as religion. They were calculated methods of maintaining divine favor and social order through systematic terror that made Roman gladiatorial games look like children's entertainment. The Celts had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed them to use fear and spiritual authority as weapons more effective than any sword. Their druids underwent training that lasted up to 20 years, memorizing vast oral traditions that included detailed instructions for conducting human sacrifices, interpreting omens from dying victims, and maintaining the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This knowledge was never written down, ensuring that only the Druids possessed the power to communicate with the gods and determine the fate of their people. Celtic law explicitly stated that certain crimes could only be atoned for through human sacrifice, creating a legal system where death became both punishment and spiritual purification. You could be condemned to ritual execution for adultery, theft, cowardice in battle, or simply for speaking against the Druids' authority. The condemned weren't just killed. They were transformed into sacred offerings whose deaths would appease the gods and ensure the community's prosperity. This created a feedback loop of terror where challenging the Druids' power meant risking not just your own life, but eternal torment in the otherworld. Women could be selected for sacrifice based on their menstrual cycles, which the Druids believed granted them special connection to lunar forces and divine wisdom. The Celtic calendar was structured around human sacrifices that corresponded to seasonal changes, agricultural cycles, and astronomical events that required blood offerings to maintain cosmic harmony. Young men who showed signs of exceptional intelligence or artistic ability were often chosen for sacrifice because the Druids believed their deaths would transfer their talents to the entire tribe. Celtic society created a paradox that would confuse modern anthropologists and religious scholars equally. While common Celtic people enjoyed relatively egalitarian social structures compared to other ancient civilizations, the Druids wielded absolute authority over life and death through their monopoly on spiritual knowledge. Celtic women could own property, initiate divorce, and serve as warriors, but they could also be dragged from their homes at any moment to serve as ritual offerings, if the Druids determined that the gods demanded their sacrifice. The Druids understood that controlling access to the divine realm meant controlling everything else in Celtic society. They served as judges in legal disputes, advisors to tribal chiefs, teachers of young warriors, and executioners of those deemed unworthy of continued existence. No decision could be made without consulting the Druids, who would interpret signs from nature, examine the entrails of sacrificed animals, or torture human victims to extract prophecies about the future. Tacitus's accounts describe Celtic festivals where entire communities gathered to witness ritual executions that lasted for days, and involved multiple victims whose deaths were choreographed like elaborate theatrical performances. The Druids had developed techniques for keeping victims alive during prolonged torture sessions, believing that extended suffering would produce more powerful spiritual energy that could be channeled toward specific goals like military victory, abundant harvests, or protection from disease. The most disturbing aspect of Celtic sacrifice wasn't the violence itself, but the systematic nature of the rituals that transformed murder into sacred ceremony. Victims were prepared through elaborate purification rites that could last for weeks, during which they were treated as living gods whose eventual deaths would bridge the gap between the human and divine realms. They were fed special foods, given psychoactive substances, and taught songs that they would sing while being killed to ensure their spirits would successfully navigate the journey to the other world. Celtic Druids had identified specific methods of execution that corresponded to different types of divine communication. Hanging victims produced prophecies about war and conflict. Drowning generated visions related to agriculture and fertility. Burning alive created insights into the movements of celestial bodies and the changing of seasons. Victims who were stabbed to death while conscious could provide information about the location of enemies, hidden treasures, or the best times to conduct raids against neighboring tribes. The archaeological evidence supporting these practices is overwhelming and terrifying. Bog bodies discovered across Celtic territories show signs of ritualistic violence that goes far beyond simple execution. Victims were strangled, stabbed, and beaten in precise patterns that suggest religious significance rather than random brutality. Many show evidence of elaborate preparation, including special diets, careful grooming, and the application of substances that would have induced altered states of consciousness before death. Celtic sacred sites contain human remains that demonstrate the industrial scale of ritual sacrifice practiced by Druid communities. At Ribemont-sur-Ancre in France, archaeologists discovered a sanctuary containing thousands of human bones, arranged in complex patterns that suggest systematic offerings conducted over several centuries. The bones show evidence of careful processing that indicates victims were not simply killed and discarded, but treated as sacred materials that required proper handling to maintain their spiritual potency. The Gundestrup cauldron, one of the most famous Celtic artifacts, depicts scenes of human sacrifice with disturbing clarity. The silver relief shows figures being held upside down over what appears to be a ritual vessel, while other panels illustrate processions of warriors and victims approaching druids who oversee elaborate ceremonies. The artistic sophistication of these depictions suggests that human sacrifice wasn't considered barbaric by Celtic standards, but represented the highest form of religious expression. Roman accounts describe Celtic head cults where the severed heads of enemies and sacrifice victims were preserved as trophies that retained the spiritual power of their original owners. These heads were displayed in sacred groves, carried into battle as protective talismans, and consulted as oracles that could provide guidance on important decisions. The Celts believed that consciousness resided in the head, making it the most valuable part of any sacrifice because it contained the victim's soul and could serve as a permanent connection to the other world. Celtic burial practices reveal a society obsessed with death and its relationship to political power. High-ranking druids were buried with collections of human skulls, iron chains used to restrain sacrifice victims, and elaborately decorated knives designed specifically for ritual execution. These grave goods weren't just symbols of authority. They were tools that the druids expected to use in the afterlife to continue their spiritual work and maintain their influence over both the living and the dead. The scale of Celtic sacrifice varied according to the perceived severity of threats facing the community. During times of war, plague, or natural disaster, entire families could be selected for execution to appease gods who were believed to be angry with the tribe's behavior. Tacitus describes witnessing a ceremony where dozens of victims were killed simultaneously in a sacred grove, while the entire community participated in chants and ritual dances that lasted from sunset to dawn. Celtic warriors participated in sacrifice rituals before major battles, believing that offering human lives to war gods would ensure victory over their enemies. These pre-battle sacrifices involved elaborate ceremonies where captives taken in previous raids were tortured to death, while druids interpreted their death throes as omens about the coming conflict. The psychological impact on Celtic warriors was profound, as they entered battle believing they had already secured divine favor through blood offerings. The Druids created a calendar system based on human sacrifice that synchronized ritual executions with astronomical events, agricultural cycles, and political needs. Major festivals like Samhain, Beltane, and Lugnasade required specific numbers of victims whose deaths would maintain cosmic balance and ensure the continued prosperity of Celtic communities. These weren't random selections. Victims were chosen months in advance based on complex criteria that included their physical appearance, social status, and perceived spiritual purity. Celtic society developed specialized roles for individuals who managed different aspects of the sacrifice system. Certain druids focused exclusively on selecting victims, while others specialized in conducting executions, interpreting omens, or maintaining sacred sites where rituals took place. Young druids underwent apprenticeships that involved assisting with sacrifices, learning to read signs from dying victims, and memorizing the vast oral traditions that governed every aspect of Celtic religious practice. The Celts believed that human sacrifice could influence weather patterns, military outcomes, and the fertility of crops and livestock. Droughts were ended through drowning rituals where victims were held underwater in sacred pools until they died, their deaths serving as appeals to rain gods who controlled precipitation. Military victories were ensured through elaborate torture sessions where enemy captives were slowly killed, while druids chanted appeals to war deities who demanded blood payments in exchange for divine assistance. Celtic sacrifice rituals often involved the entire community in ways that made every individual complicit in the violence, while reinforcing social bonds through shared participation in sacred murder. Children were taught to view human sacrifice as normal and necessary, with young Celts receiving their first exposure to ritual violence through carefully controlled ceremonies where they observed executions from designated viewing areas. This early indoctrination ensured that future generations would accept the Druid system without question, while preparing them to serve as either executioners or victims when their time came. The psychological techniques employed by Celtic Druids to maintain control over their communities were sophisticated and effective. They created elaborate mythologies that explained every aspect of daily life through supernatural forces that could only be influenced through proper sacrifice rituals. Natural disasters, military defeats, diseases, and crop failures were all attributed to insufficient offerings to the gods, creating a system where any misfortune could be blamed on inadequate human sacrifice and corrected through additional executions. Celtic Druids understood that controlling the narrative around death meant controlling the living population's behavior and beliefs. They positioned themselves as the sole intermediaries between the human and divine realms, making their authority unquestionable because challenging the Druids meant risking not just immediate execution, but eternal torment in the other world. This spiritual monopoly allowed relatively small groups of Druids to exercise absolute control over much larger populations who believed their survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces. The economic impact of Celtic sacrifice systems was substantial, as communities devoted significant resources to supporting the Druid hierarchy and maintaining the elaborate infrastructure required for large-scale ritual execution. Sacred groves required constant maintenance, ritual implements needed regular replacement, and victims had to be fed and housed during extended preparation periods before sacrifice. This created an entire economy based on death that provided employment for craftsmen who specialized in manufacturing execution equipment, architects who designed sacrifice sites, and artists who created the elaborate decorations that adorned Celtic religious centers. Celtic trade networks spread knowledge of sacrifice techniques across vast distances, with Druids from different tribes sharing information about effective execution methods, improved techniques for interpreting omens, and innovations in victim preparation that enhanced the spiritual power generated by ritual death. This intellectual exchange created a standardized system of human sacrifice that unified Celtic communities across Europe, while ensuring that Druid knowledge continued to evolve and improve over time. The Roman conquest of Celtic territories required military strategies specifically designed to neutralize the psychological impact of Druid sacrifice rituals on both Celtic resistance and Roman morale. Roman commanders understood that Celtic Druids would attempt to use human sacrifice to demoralize Roman troops and strengthen Celtic resolve, leading to targeted campaigns aimed at destroying sacred groves, executing Druids, and disrupting the religious infrastructure that supported Celtic resistance to Roman authority. The gradual decline of Celtic sacrifice practices occurred over several centuries, as Roman administration, Christian missionaries, and changing social conditions undermined the Druid system that had maintained these rituals for generations. However, archaeological evidence suggests that some forms of ritual execution continued in remote Celtic communities well into the medieval period, with Christian saints' lives containing references to struggles against pagan practices that included human sacrifice disguised as folk traditions. The Celtic legacy of ritualized violence influenced European attitudes toward death, spirituality, and political authority in ways that continued long after the Druids themselves had disappeared. Medieval concepts of trial by ordeal, the divine right of kings, and the spiritual significance of martyrdom all contained elements that could be traced back to Celtic beliefs about the relationship between death and divine power. Modern neo-pagan movements have attempted to revive Celtic religious practices, while carefully avoiding the human sacrifice elements that formed the core of historical Druid spirituality. The transformation of Celtic sacrifice rituals into folk traditions, fairy tales, and literary themes allowed these practices to survive in modified forms that preserved their psychological impact while removing their literal violence. Stories about magical groves, supernatural beings who demanded human offerings, and heroes who faced death to save their communities all contained cultural memories of Celtic sacrifice systems that had been sanitized for societies that no longer accepted human sacrifice as religiously necessary. Celtic druids created a system where death became the ultimate currency in negotiations with supernatural forces, establishing precedents for later European beliefs about martyrdom, sacrifice, and the spiritual value of suffering that influenced Christian theology, medieval knighthood, and modern concepts of heroic self-sacrifice. Their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social control through ritualized violence provided models that were later adapted by other religious and political systems seeking to maintain authority through carefully managed applications of terror and spiritual authority. The archaeological record continues to reveal new evidence of Celtic sacrifice practices, with recent discoveries in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales uncovering ritual sites that demonstrate the geographical extent and temporal duration of Druid sacrifice systems. These findings challenge modern assumptions about ancient Celtic society while providing insights into how human communities can develop elaborate justifications for systematic violence when such practices become integrated with religious beliefs and social structures. What other ancient civilizations developed sophisticated systems of ritualized violence that combined religious authority with political control? The evidence suggests that human sacrifice was far more widespread in the ancient world than modern people typically realize, with cultures across every continent developing their own variations on the basic theme of using death as a tool for managing both divine and human relationships. The Celtic example demonstrates how quickly societies can normalize extreme violence when such practices become embedded in religious traditions and supported by intellectual frameworks that present brutality as a spiritual necessity rather than criminal behavior. The most disturbing aspect of Celtic sacrifice culture wasn't just the scale of the violence, but how completely it had infiltrated every aspect of daily life. Children grew up playing games that mimicked sacrifice rituals, using dolls made from straw and animal bones to practice the ceremonies they would one day witness or participate in as adults. Young Celtic girls learned to weave garlands that would be placed on sacrifice victims, while boys practiced the chants and movements that accompanied ritual executions. This wasn't considered morbid or inappropriate. It was essential education that prepared children for their roles in maintaining cosmic balance through properly conducted blood offerings. Celtic marriage ceremonies incorporated elements of sacrifice ritual that demonstrated how deeply these practices had penetrated social customs that seemed completely unrelated to religious violence. Newlyweds would offer small animals to ensure fertility, but the techniques used to kill these creatures directly mirrored the methods employed in human sacrifice. Wedding guests would participate in mock executions using effigies that represented potential threats to the couple's happiness, while druids would examine the entrails of slaughtered livestock to predict the success of the marriage based on patterns that they claimed revealed divine approval or disapproval. The economic implications of constant human sacrifice created entire industries devoted to supporting the infrastructure of ritualized death. Celtic artisans specialized in crafting the ornate knives, chains, and ceremonial implements used in executions, with master craftsmen achieving high social status through their ability to create tools that enhanced the spiritual power generated by ritual killing. Merchants traded in exotic substances used to prepare victims for sacrifice, including rare herbs that induced visions, minerals that were ground into paints for body decoration, and precious metals that were fashioned into jewelry worn by those selected for execution. Celtic agricultural practices were synchronized with sacrifice schedules that determined when crops could be planted, harvested, and stored based on the availability of human victims whose deaths would ensure divine blessing for farming activities. Farmers couldn't begin spring planting until druids had conducted the appropriate executions to appease earth goddesses who controlled soil fertility. Harvest festivals required the sacrifice of individuals whose blood would be mixed with the first grains to guarantee that stored food would last through winter months when fresh supplies were unavailable. The travel networks that connected Celtic communities across Europe facilitated the exchange of sacrifice victims between tribes, creating a continental market in human beings designated for ritual execution. Druids would negotiate trades that sent locally born victims to distant communities while importing foreigners whose exotic origins were believed to enhance their value as offerings to gods who demanded variety in their blood tributes. These exchanges also served political purposes, as trading sacrifice victims created alliances between tribes and demonstrated mutual commitment to shared religious practices. Celtic legal systems incorporated sacrifice as both punishment and legal procedure, with certain types of disputes requiring human execution to determine guilt or innocence through divine judgment. Accused individuals could be subjected to ritual torture that would either kill them if they were guilty, or miraculously spare them if the gods determined their innocence. Witnesses in important legal cases were sometimes sacrificed after giving testimony to prevent them from changing their stories and to ensure that their souls would be available in the other world to provide additional evidence if needed. The psychological conditioning that enabled ordinary Celtic people to participate in or witness systematic murder without experiencing mental breakdown involved sophisticated techniques that gradually desensitized communities to extreme violence through incremental exposure to increasingly graphic rituals. Children first observed the sacrifice of insects and small animals before progressing to larger creatures and eventually human victims. Adults who showed signs of distress during executions were themselves subject to sacrifice as individuals whose spiritual weakness threatened the community's relationship with divine forces. Celtic Druids developed elaborate philosophical justifications for human sacrifice that presented systematic murder as acts of compassion that freed victims from the suffering of earthly existence while enabling their souls to achieve higher spiritual states in the other world. These intellectual frameworks made participation in ritual killing feel morally superior to normal behavior, with Druids teaching that those who refused to support sacrifice practices were actually committing acts of cruelty by denying victims the opportunity to transcend human limitations through properly conducted death rituals. The selection criteria for sacrifice victims revealed the complex social dynamics that governed Celtic communities, with certain categories of individuals being considered more valuable as offerings based on factors that included physical appearance, social status, perceived spiritual purity, and astronomical conditions at the time of their birth. Twins were especially prized because Druids believed their deaths would create powerful spiritual energy through the simultaneous departure of souls that had shared physical existence. Individuals born during eclipses or other celestial events were marked from birth as future sacrifice candidates whose deaths would be timed to correspond with similar astronomical phenomena. Celtic sacrifice rituals often involved the participation of victims who had been conditioned to view their own execution as the highest honor possible, with some individuals actually competing for selection as offerings to particularly important deities. This psychological manipulation was achieved through years of preparation that convinced potential victims that their deaths would ensure the survival and prosperity of their families, their tribe, and their entire civilization. Druids would craft elaborate personal mythologies around selected victims, teaching them that they had been chosen by the gods for special purposes that could only be fulfilled through ritual death. The aftermath of major sacrifice ceremonies required extensive cleanup procedures that transformed execution sites back into normal community gathering places, with the Celtic workers specializing in the proper disposal of human remains, the cleansing of ritual implements, and the purification of sacred spaces that had been contaminated by death. These sanitation protocols weren't simply practical measures. They were religious obligations that required specific techniques to prevent the spiritual pollution generated by human sacrifice from spreading to other areas of Celtic territory. Celtic seasonal festivals created annual cycles of anticipation and terror as communities prepared for regularly scheduled sacrifice events that marked important transitions in the natural world. The approach of major holidays brought both excitement and dread, as families wondered whether their members would be selected for execution, while simultaneously looking forward to the spiritual benefits that would result from properly conducted ritual deaths. These mixed emotions created complex psychological states that bound communities together through shared experiences of fear, relief, and vicarious participation in sacred violence. The training programs that prepared young druids for careers in ritual execution involved systematic desensitization to human suffering, combined with intensive education in the theological justifications for systematic murder. Apprentice druids began their education by assisting with animal sacrifices before gradually assuming greater responsibilities in human execution ceremonies. The most advanced students were required to personally conduct their first human sacrifice as a graduation requirement that demonstrated their commitment to Druid principles and their readiness to assume full responsibility for maintaining cosmic balance through properly administered death. Celtic communities developed sophisticated systems for managing the psychological trauma experienced by individuals who witnessed or participated in human sacrifice, with specialized healers treating people who suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from exposure to extreme violence. However, these treatments weren't designed to help people reject sacrifice practices, but rather to strengthen their ability to continue participating in ritual executions without experiencing debilitating emotional consequences that might interfere with community religious obligations. The decline of Celtic sacrifice practices occurred gradually as Roman occupation, Christian conversion, and social change undermined the conditions that had supported systematic ritual murder for centuries. However, the psychological patterns established by generations of normalized violence continued to influence Celtic communities long after human sacrifice officially ended, with archaeological evidence suggesting that symbolic executions and ritualized violence persisted in modified forms well into the medieval period. Modern archaeological investigations continue to uncover evidence of Celtic sacrifice practices that challenge contemporary understanding of ancient European civilization, with new discoveries revealing that ritual human execution was even more widespread and systematic than previously believed. These findings force reconsideration of assumptions about the development of European culture and raise uncomfortable questions about the capacity of human societies to normalize extreme violence when such practices become integrated with religious beliefs and social institutions. The Celtic legacy demonstrates how quickly civilized societies can develop elaborate justifications for systematic brutality when violence becomes sanctified through religious authority and intellectual frameworks that present murder as spiritual necessity. Their sophisticated systems of ritualized execution provided models that influenced later European approaches to punishment, warfare, and social control, with elements of Celtic sacrifice culture persisting in modified forms throughout the medieval period and beyond. What lessons can modern societies learn from the Celtic experience with institutionalized violence disguised as religious practice? The evidence suggests that human communities remain vulnerable to similar patterns when authority figures successfully combine spiritual claims with systematic brutality, creating conditions where ordinary people can participate in or support extreme violence while believing they are serving higher moral purposes. The Celtic example serves as a warning about the ease with which civilized societies can slip into barbarism when violence becomes normalized through religious and intellectual justifications that present cruelty as virtue. The most chilling aspect of Celtic sacrifice culture was how seamlessly it integrated with what would otherwise be considered normal family life. Celtic parents didn't shelter their children from ritual executions. They brought them to witness these events as essential educational experiences that would prepare young people for their adult responsibilities in maintaining cosmic balance. Families would pack food and make day-long expeditions to sacred groves where they would watch druids slowly torture victims to death while interpreting the significance of various death throes for children who were expected to learn the complex symbolic language of ritual murder. Celtic households maintained shrines containing human skulls, dried blood, and other relics from sacrifice ceremonies, with family members offering daily prayers to these grisly trophies that were believed to provide protection and guidance from the otherworld. Children grew up handling human bones as casually as modern kids play with toys, learning to recognize different types of skull fractures, and understanding which execution methods produced the most spiritually powerful remains. This normalization of death artifacts ensured that future generations would view human sacrifice as an ordinary aspect of religious practice rather than horrific violence. The Celtic calendar system required families to participate in community sacrifice events that punctuated the year with regular episodes of ritualized violence. Parents would explain to their children that certain seasons demanded blood offerings to ensure successful harvests, protection from enemies, and favorable weather conditions. Young Celts learned to associate the changing seasons with the screams of sacrifice victims, creating psychological connections between natural cycles and human suffering that made ritual execution seem as inevitable and necessary as sunrise and sunset. Celtic educational practices included formal instruction in sacrifice techniques, with young people receiving training in victim selection, execution methods, and the interpretation of omens extracted from dying humans. Students learned to identify physical characteristics that made individuals suitable for specific types of sacrifice, understand the proper timing for different execution rituals, and recognize the signs that indicated whether the gods were pleased with the particular offerings. This curriculum ensured that every adult Celtic citizen possessed the knowledge necessary to participate effectively in community sacrifice activities. The economic structure of Celtic communities created incentives for families to support the sacrifice system, even when they might privately question its morality. Druids controlled access to essential services including medical treatment, legal representation, and agricultural advice, making it economically impossible for families to survive without maintaining good relationships with the religious authorities who demanded regular human offerings. Parents who expressed doubts about sacrifice practices could find themselves unable to obtain help when their children became sick, their crops failed, or they needed legal protection from accusations of wrongdoing. Celtic marriage customs incorporated elements that prepared couples for the possibility that their future children might be selected for sacrifice, with wedding ceremonies including rituals that symbolically offered the unborn offspring to various deities who might later claim them for execution. Newlyweds received instruction in the proper attitudes toward child rearing that emphasized the temporary nature of parental relationships and the higher calling that might require families to surrender their children for the good of the community. This psychological preparation helped parents cope with the eventual loss of children to sacrifice without developing resentment toward the Druid system. The foster care arrangements common in Celtic society served multiple purposes related to sacrifice culture, as children were routinely sent to live with relatives or family friends who could provide different types of education and social connections. However, these fostering relationships also functioned as a method for distributing the emotional impact of child sacrifice across extended kinship networks, ensuring that no single family would bear the full psychological burden of losing multiple children to ritual execution. Foster parents often formed stronger emotional bonds with children than biological parents, creating complex family dynamics that helped communities cope with systematic infanticide. Celtic communities developed elaborate systems for commemorating sacrifice victims that transformed murdered individuals into permanent fixtures of local religious culture. Families would commission artists to create memorial sculptures, compose songs about their deceased relatives, and establish annual festivals celebrating the spiritual contributions made by their sacrificed loved ones. These commemorative practices served dual purposes of honoring the dead while reinforcing community commitment to sacrifice traditions that might otherwise be questioned by grieving relatives. The seasonal migration patterns of Celtic tribes were coordinated with sacrifice schedules that required communities to travel to specific sacred sites where execution rituals had to be performed at designated times of the year. These religious pilgrimages created opportunities for different Celtic groups to exchange sacrifice victims, share execution techniques, and coordinate their ritual calendars to maximize the spiritual benefits obtained from systematically murdering members of their communities. The logistics of moving entire populations to participate in mass execution events required sophisticated organizational skills that Celtic leaders used to demonstrate their competence and maintain their authority. Celtic military practices incorporated pre-battle sacrifice rituals that served both spiritual and psychological purposes, as warriors witnessed the execution of captives or volunteers before engaging in combat that might result in their own deaths. These ceremonies created emotional states that combined religious ecstasy with anticipation of violence, preparing Celtic fighters for battle while reinforcing their belief that death in combat would be rewarded with eternal glory in the other world. Warriors who participated in sacrifice rituals before battle reported enhanced courage and reduced fear of death, suggesting that exposure to ritual murder actually improved military performance. The medical knowledge possessed by Celtic Druids included detailed understanding of human anatomy, gained through their extensive experience conducting executions and examining sacrifice victims. Druids could identify vital organs, understand blood flow patterns, and predict how long victims would survive different types of wounds based on their accumulated experience with systematic torture and murder. This medical expertise made Druids valuable as healers and surgeons, creating additional incentives for communities to maintain good relationships with religious authorities who possessed both the power to cause death and the knowledge to prevent it. Celtic diplomatic practices included the exchange of sacrifice victims between tribes as a method for establishing political alliances and demonstrating mutual commitment to shared religious values. Diplomatic marriages were often accompanied by the gift of humans designated for execution, with the receiving community expected to conduct elaborate sacrifice ceremonies that honored both the victims and the political relationships they represented. These human exchanges created networks of obligation and mutual dependence that helped maintain peace between Celtic groups, while reinforcing the central role of sacrifice in their political systems. The artistic traditions of Celtic culture incorporated motifs and techniques inspired by human sacrifice, with metalworkers, sculptors, and painters drawing inspiration from the visual elements of ritual execution. Celtic art featured recurring images of severed heads, bound victims, and execution scenes that were integrated into decorative objects used in daily life. Wealthy Celtic families commissioned elaborate artwork that celebrated famous sacrifice ceremonies, with skilled artists competing to create the most realistic depictions of ritual violence that would serve as permanent reminders of their community's religious devotion. Celtic legal traditions included provisions for determining when sacrifice was required to resolve disputes, restore cosmic balance, or atone for community-wide sins that threatened divine punishment. Legal proceedings often concluded with the selection of individuals who would be executed to satisfy supernatural justice that human courts were believed incapable of administering. These legal sacrifices created precedents that influenced later European concepts of criminal punishment and divine justice, with elements of Celtic sacrifice law persisting in modified forms throughout the medieval period. The psychological profiles of individuals who volunteered for sacrifice revealed complex motivations that included religious devotion, social pressure, mental illness, and the desire to escape intolerable life circumstances. Some volunteers were motivated by genuine belief that their deaths would benefit their communities, while others saw sacrifice as preferable to continued existence in societies that offered limited opportunities for personal fulfillment or social advancement. Druids became skilled at identifying potential volunteers and manipulating their psychological vulnerabilities to ensure steady supplies of willing victims for ritual execution. Celtic communities developed specialized roles for individuals who managed different aspects of victim preparation, including body painters who created elaborate decorations, musicians who composed death songs, and storytellers who crafted personal mythologies for each sacrifice candidate. These support personnel helped transform the process of preparing for execution into elaborate cultural productions that engaged entire communities in collaborative efforts to create meaningful death experiences for sacrifice victims. The artistic and emotional investment required for these preparations made it psychologically difficult for communities to question the value or morality of systematic murder. The aftermath procedures following major sacrifice ceremonies included community-wide purification rituals designed to cleanse participants of spiritual contamination resulting from exposure to death and violence. These cleansing ceremonies served psychological functions that helped ordinary Celtic citizens process their participation in or witness of extreme violence without developing lasting trauma that might interfere with future sacrifice activities. The purification rituals also reinforced community bonds by creating shared experiences of spiritual renewal that followed episodes of collective violence. Celtic funeral practices for individuals who died natural deaths incorporated elements borrowed from sacrifice rituals, demonstrating how thoroughly execution ceremonies had influenced all aspects of death culture in these communities. Natural deaths were sometimes viewed as spiritually inferior to ritual executions, leading families to conduct symbolic sacrifice ceremonies for deceased relatives who had missed the opportunity to die properly through Druid-administered violence. These supplementary rituals were designed to enhance the spiritual status of naturally deceased individuals and ensure their successful transition to the other world. The training programs for Celtic warriors included instruction in sacrifice techniques that would be useful during raids against enemy communities, with experienced fighters teaching younger men how to conduct field executions that would terrorize opponents while generating spiritual power for military purposes. Celtic raiders were trained to identify suitable sacrifice candidates among enemy populations and understand the proper procedures for conducting executions that would maximize both psychological impact and religious benefits. This military application of sacrifice knowledge made Celtic armies particularly effective at breaking enemy morale through systematic terror campaigns. The decline of Celtic sacrifice practices created significant social disruption as communities struggled to maintain religious and cultural traditions without the ritualized violence that had previously organized their spiritual lives. former sacrifice sites became pilgrimage destinations where people could visit locations associated with their murdered ancestors, while abandoned execution equipment was preserved as religious relics that connected later generations with their violent heritage. The gradual elimination of human sacrifice left psychological and cultural voids that Celtic communities attempted to fill through modified rituals that preserved symbolic elements of their execution traditions. Modern archaeological research continues to reveal the extent and sophistication of Celtic sacrifice systems, with new discoveries demonstrating that ritual murder was even more prevalent and organized than previously understood. These findings challenge romantic notions about ancient Celtic culture while providing insights into the human capacity for normalizing extreme violence through religious and cultural justifications. The Celtic example remains relevant for understanding how civilized societies can develop and maintain institutions that systematically murder their own members, while convincing participants that such violence serves higher moral and spiritual purposes. The most disturbing discoveries in recent Celtic archaeological sites involve evidence of sacrifice factories, specialized facilities designed for the mass production of ritual deaths that operated with the efficiency of modern industrial operations. These sites contain multiple execution chambers, victim preparation areas, and sophisticated drainage systems for managing the blood and bodily fluids generated by systematic murder. The archaeological evidence suggests that some Celtic communities had developed ritualized killing into a large-scale operation that processed dozens of victims simultaneously during major religious festivals. Recent excavations at Tara in Ireland have uncovered a complex of buildings that appears to have functioned as a training academy for druids specializing in human sacrifice. The site contains practice chambers where apprentice executioners could develop their skills using condemned criminals before graduating to more prestigious victims during major ceremonies. Skeletal remains found in these training areas show evidence of experimental torture techniques and botched executions that suggest young druids were encouraged to innovate and develop new methods for extracting spiritual power from dying humans. Chemical analysis of Celtic sacrifice sites has revealed the use of sophisticated drug cocktails designed to enhance both the suffering of victims and the psychological impact on witnesses. Celtic druids had developed expertise in pharmacology that allowed them to create substances that would keep victims conscious during prolonged torture, induce specific types of hallucinations, or produce dramatic death convulsions that could be interpreted as divine communication. These chemical enhancements transformed simple executions into elaborate theatrical productions that maximized both spiritual and entertainment value. The discovery of Celtic sacrifice manuals carved into stone tablets has provided unprecedented insight into the systematic nature of ritual murder in these communities. These instruction guides contain detailed specifications for conducting different types of executions, recipes for victim preparation substances, and scoring systems for evaluating the spiritual effectiveness of various torture techniques. The manuals reveal that Celtic sacrifice was not random violence, but a highly technical field requiring years of study and practice to master properly. Genetic analysis of bog bodies and other Celtic sacrifice victims has revealed patterns suggesting that certain family lineages were systematically targeted for ritual execution across multiple generations. Some Celtic communities appear to have maintained hereditary sacrifice bloodlines, with families being bred specifically to produce victims for ritual murder. Children born into these sacrifice lineages were raised with the knowledge that they would eventually be executed, creating unique psychological profiles that combined acceptance of inevitable death with desperate attempts to delay their selection for as long as possible. The scale of Celtic sacrifice operations is becoming clearer through analysis of ancient landscape modifications that created infrastructure for mass execution events. Celtic communities built elaborate amphitheaters, drainage systems, and access roads specifically designed to accommodate large-scale sacrifice ceremonies that could process hundreds of victims during major religious festivals. These facilities required significant investment of labor and resources, demonstrating that systematic murder was considered essential enough to justify massive public works projects. Carbon dating of Celtic sacrifice sites has revealed that some locations were used continuously for ritual execution for over 1,000 years, with successive generations adding new facilities and expanding existing infrastructure to accommodate growing demand for human offerings. The longevity of these murder sites suggests that Celtic sacrifice culture was not a temporary aberration, but a stable institutional feature that persisted across multiple cultural transitions and political changes. The discovery of Celtic record-keeping systems has revealed meticulous documentation of sacrifice activities that tracked victim selection, execution methods, and spiritual outcomes with bureaucratic precision. Celtic Druids maintained detailed databases of sacrificial effectiveness, recording which types of victims produced the most reliable omens, which execution techniques generated the most powerful spiritual energy, and which seasonal timing maximized divine favor. This data collection allowed Druids to optimize their murder operations and demonstrate measurable results to communities that invested heavily in systematic killing. Recent analysis of Celtic DNA has revealed genetic markers associated with psychological traits that may have made certain individuals more suitable for roles as either executioners or victims in sacrifice systems. Celtic communities appear to have practiced selective breeding designed to produce individuals with specific mental characteristics that enhanced their effectiveness in ritual murder scenarios. This genetic engineering created distinct psychological profiles within Celtic populations that supported the institutional structures necessary for large-scale human sacrifice. The examination of Celtic trade networks has revealed international commerce in sacrifice victims, with Celtic communities importing and exporting humans designated for ritual execution across vast distances. Celtic merchants specialized in identifying and acquiring individuals with rare physical characteristics, exotic cultural backgrounds, or unusual psychological profiles that would enhance their value as offerings to particular deities. This international trade in sacrifice victims created diplomatic relationships between Celtic communities and distant cultures that shared similar religious practices. Archaeological evidence from Celtic settlements shows that sacrifice victims were sometimes kept alive for months or years in specialized facilities that conditioned them for eventual execution while extracting labor and entertainment value during their preparation period. These victim farms combined aspects of slavery, psychological conditioning, and agricultural production to maximize the economic and spiritual benefits obtained from each individual designated for ritual murder. The victims were trained to perform specific roles during their execution ceremonies while being gradually prepared psychologically for their eventual deaths. The discovery of Celtic surgical instruments designed specifically for human sacrifice has revealed the medical sophistication underlying their execution techniques. Celtic executioners used precision tools that allowed them to conduct elaborate torture sessions without accidentally killing victims prematurely, enabling extended ceremonies that could last for days while maintaining victim consciousness and responsiveness. These specialized instruments required advanced metallurgical knowledge and skilled craftsmanship that elevated ritual murder to the level of sophisticated medical procedure. Celtic astronomical calculations reveal that sacrifice schedules were coordinated with celestial events according to complex mathematical formulas that required advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and calendar systems. Celtic Druids developed computational methods for determining optimal execution timing that took into account lunar phases, planetary alignments, and seasonal transitions to maximize the spiritual energy generated by ritual deaths. This scientific approach to murder demonstrates how Celtic communities applied intellectual sophistication to systematize and optimize their violence. The analysis of Celtic victim preparation procedures has revealed elaborate systems for enhancing the spiritual and entertainment value of sacrifice ceremonies through careful attention to victim psychology, physical condition, and dramatic presentation. Celtic communities invested significant resources in training sacrifice victims to perform specific roles during their executions, teaching them songs, dances, and speeches that would enhance the ceremonial impact of their deaths while ensuring that they cooperated willingly with their own murder. Celtic communities developed quality control systems for evaluating the effectiveness of sacrifice rituals, with specialized personnel responsible for monitoring spiritual outcomes and adjusting execution procedures to improve results. These quality assurance programs included customer satisfaction surveys, where community members could rate the entertainment value and spiritual impact of different sacrifice ceremonies, leading to continuous improvement in murder techniques and victim selection criteria. The psychological conditioning programs used to prepare both executioners and victims reveal sophisticated understanding of human mental processes that enabled Celtic communities to maintain large-scale murder operations without widespread psychological breakdown among participants. Celtic Druids developed therapeutic techniques for treating individuals who experienced trauma from participating in or witnessing extreme violence. But these treatments focused on strengthening participants' ability to continue engaging with sacrifice systems rather than helping them reject violence altogether. Recent discoveries of Celtic communication networks reveal that sacrifice techniques and innovations were shared between communities across vast distances through organized knowledge exchange programs. Celtic Druids maintained correspondence networks that facilitated the rapid spread of new execution methods, victim preparation techniques, and spiritual interpretation systems. This intellectual collaboration created standardized sacrifice practices across Celtic territories, while encouraging continued innovation in ritual murder technologies. The economic analysis of Celtic sacrifice systems reveals that systematic murder generated substantial economic benefits through multiple revenue streams, including entertainment fees, spiritual services, victim trading, and manufacturing of execution equipment. Celtic communities that specialized in large-scale sacrifice operations became wealthy through their ability to provide murder services to neighboring groups, while developing expertise that commanded premium prices in international markets for ritual violence. Celtic legal systems evolved to support sacrifice operations through legislation that criminalized interference with execution ceremonies, protected the property rights of sacrifice victim owners, and established regulatory frameworks for managing the trade in humans designated for ritual murder. These legal protections ensured that Celtic sacrifice systems could operate efficiently without disruption from individuals who might object to systematic killing on moral or practical grounds. The preservation techniques used for Celtic sacrifice sites were designed to maintain these locations as permanent monuments to ritualized violence that would inspire future generations to continue traditions of systematic murder. Celtic communities invested in architectural features, artistic decorations, and maintenance systems that would ensure sacrifice sites remained functional and psychologically impressive for centuries after their construction, creating lasting infrastructure for institutional violence. The Celtic example demonstrates how quickly human societies can develop elaborate justifications for extreme violence when such practices become integrated with religious authority, economic incentives, and cultural traditions that present systematic murder as essential for community survival and spiritual well-being. Their sophisticated approach to institutionalized killing provides insights into the psychological and social mechanisms that enable civilized people to participate in or support extreme violence while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness and social respectability. What other historical examples reveal similar patterns of normalized violence disguised as religious or cultural necessity?